Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Andrews Memorial Theater. My name is Alan Mann. I am the Artistic Director of Opera Theater of Connecticut, as well as the Staging Director for the production of Puccini's La Bohème, which you are here to see today. It's like in the airplane, if you're not here for La Bohème, you're in the wrong theater. This is a moment we call Opera Talk. It's an opportunity for me to get pushed out of everybody's way, so I stop disturbing everyone for 30 minutes. And it's also a chance for me to share with you some of the wonderful stories about Puccini, about La Bohème, and perhaps a little insight and concept of some of the moments of the show that you should be looking out for. When we talk about Puccini, it's important to know that we are not talking about a great composer of opera. We are, in fact, talking about a composer of great operas, and there's a slight difference. Men like Mozart, Rossini, Verdi, and Wagner, these were great composers. These were men who entered into the scene where opera needed fixing. There were problems with it. It always stayed, one or two generations behind, and these were the forces that moved it forward and made it much more relevant for its audience. It's important to point out that Puccini's first great opera, Manon Lescaut, opened the same week as Verdi's last opera, Falstaff. So the two blend one into the other. But by the time Puccini is writing opera, Verdi has done the work. He has gotten rid of all of the strict restrictions, and he has made it much more a people's art form. Plus, there is at this point the movement towards verismo that Puccini didn't necessarily embrace, but he took great advantage of. He was born on December 22nd in 1858. He was the sixth child in his family. The older five were sisters. He did eventually have a brother born 5 years later, but that was the same year that his father died. So he was raised by five sisters, a mother, and his mother's sister. So this explains why the women in Puccini's operas are all treated slightly better than other composers at the time. Simply, he had so many more to answer to. And there's also a trait in the great Puccini operas where you hear the heroine before you actually see her. Now, I was raised in a family with three sisters, a mother, many, many aunts, no father, and I can tell you as a young man looking for a couple of moments of solitude, when the sisters decide it's time to get you involved in something, you can hear them coming before you see them. So I think that that's why Puccini puts that into the operas, that you get a sense that they're arriving, that anticipation before they come in. When his father passed away, Puccini inherited the position of organist and choir master at St. Martin's Cathedral in Lucca. That was a job that was considered hereditary. The first Giacomo Puccini, who came to Lucca in 1720 when the cathedral was being built, got the job, and it had been a Puccini who had had the job for about 150 years. Now, at 5 years old, Puccini was too young to take over the job, so his father's brother did. His father's brother also took over the salary, which meant that there was no income for the Puccini family. And they lived in abject poverty on an allowance given to them by their uncle. And this was a lot of problems and tension in the family. Puccini himself was not interested in taking on the job. He was musically talented, but it wasn't anything that really interested him. When he was younger, he made a lot of money playing piano at weddings. He played at a bar. And he also played at the local bordello, where he met the first woman he fell in love with, and her name was Lola. Now, the reason that's important is his great friend was Pietro Mascagni. And when Mascagni is writing Cavalleria Rusticana, and he has a temptress who is married but still wants to seduce other men, he picks the name of Lola for her as a tribute to Puccini's first love. At 16, he takes over the job. He has to, and now he's getting the money, and he won't give his uncle any, and again, family problems continue for many, many years. While he's there, he and his great friend, a young man by the name of Zizzania, discover that there are many pipes in the organ made out of metal, that have a lot of metal, that are rarely, if ever, used. You have 16-foot metal pipes, one 32-foot metal pipe. And if you don't play them a lot, you could take that pipe, you could sell it for scrap metal prices, and you could have a fair amount of money. And so they started to do this. They did selective borrowing of the pipes and turning the lead into silver, as it were. And this went on for a little while. It was kind of all fell apart one day when Puccini was actually too sick to attend the service, and somebody else played the organ, and they discovered that lots of little notes didn't play. They had no proof, of course, it was Puccini, but at this point, as things are getting a little tense for him at Lucca, something happens that changes music history forever. Giuseppe Verdi's great hit at that time was Aida. And in those days, you didn't actually travel anywhere to go and see a show. Opera companies toured. And if you remember back to the 20s all the way to the 50s, early 60s, even the Metropolitan Opera used to tour around the United States. So Verdi was conducting Aida in Pisa, a mere 20 miles away from Lucca, and Puccini, Zizzania, and another one of their friends are going to go and see the opera. They walk the 20 miles. Do they have tickets? No. Do they have money for the tickets? No. How are they going to get in to see the show? Well, the backstage doorman is from Lucca. He's a family friend. They talk their way into watching the show from the wings. They love it. And on the way back, at that night, this is March 11th, 1876, Puccini turns to his friends and he says, "That's what I want to do. I want to become an opera composer." They write to Queen Margherita to get a tuition so that they can study in Milan. If you're going to study music in Italy, you go to Milan, and the place is the Milan Conservatory. And the aunt has a friend who's a lady-in-waiting to Queen Margherita. Now, this is 5 years after the Risorgimento. The country we know as Italy doesn't exist until 1871. They have established a new king and a new queen, and they are wild about inspiring all things Italian, especially the Italian arts. So she says, "All right, I will cover your tuition, and I will give you a stipend of 100 lira a month for a year." The Milan Conservatory was wildly famous, by the way. Verdi had gone there, Donizetti went there, many composers go to the Milan Conservatory. So this is a coup for him. He gets there and he starts to study. He ends up staying there for 3 years on this allowance. So he is again living in abject poverty, rooming with lots of people. One of the people he meets at this point is Pietro Mascagni, and the two of them room together. And there are wonderful stories about them. And in fact, the character of Chenard is based more on Pietro Mascagni than the character in the novel. And so he puts a lot of personal stuff into that character creation. So he's there, he studies hard, he learns a lot, he meets a lot of people, he becomes a chain smoker, and he graduates from school after 3 years, and it's now time to take that big step forward. And in Italy, the way to become an opera composer was to write a one-act opera and to enter it into one of the many one-act opera competitions. Now, these were quite popular in Italy. They were run by publishing companies. The only one that didn't do that was Ricordi, because they were too famous. But this was the Sozzogno recording company, publishing company, and he writes a one-act opera called Le Villi, and he submits it to the 5 judges. 4 of them don't even look at it. It's dismissed right out of hand. The reason it's dismissed right out of hand is he ran out of manuscript paper before he finished, and in fact used the paper that their food had come wrapped in, drew the musical staves on it, completed its composition, and submitted it. So 4 of the judges don't even look at it. Another great moment of fortune in history is that the one judge who does look at it is a man by the name of Arrigo Boito. And Arrigo Boito not only was a minor composer in his own right, he was a librettist for Donizetti, he was a librettist for Verdi, he was very, very popular, and he was the poet laureate of the New Italy. He looked at this and said, "This is the best thing that's been submitted in the competition." He got his friends to give him money so he could present it. He got the students from the Milan Conservatory to be in the orchestra. He invited people to attend it, and he invited Giulio Ricordi of the Ricordi family to come and listen to the opera. Now you have to remember, the Ricordi's don't publish one-act operas in those days. The fact that Boito gets him to come is a tribute to the power of Boito. Le Villi is a story about the spirits of young women who have died of broken hearts when their boyfriends have rejected them. They live in the forests outside of the towns, and when young men are unfaithful or do something cruel to their girlfriends and they're caught in the forest at night, the spirits of these young women grab them and dance them to death. It's a euphemism. You can take that wherever you want. And in English, it's called the Willies. So if you ever heard of anybody having a case of the Willies, this is where that comes from. The opera does very well. It shows itself, shows a lot of good talent. And Ricordi says, I tell you what, if you can turn that into a 2-act opera, I'll publish it. Now remember, there's no intellectual property rights. If he publishes it, he owns it. So they say, okay, he does that. Now, there's a lot of dance in it, as you can imagine. So what Puccini does is he writes 2 more dances, says, here's where there's a good logical break in the plot, kind of, splits it open, writes an intermezzo to go here at the start of the 2nd act, and says, here's a 2-act opera. Ricordi publishes it, and within a year, not only is it being performed in Italy and parts of Europe, it's even being performed in Buenos Aires. And so there's money. They share the money with Puccini. He starts to realize, I can do well at this. And Ricordi says, I'm going to commission you to write a 2nd opera. Here's the story. It's a Norse myth, Edgar. So he gives it to Puccini to write. And he says, here's the amount of money we'll pay you to do it. And while you're writing it, we'll give you an allowance over the time. And, if it takes about, 18 months, 2 years, you'll still do well. It drags on. It drags on. Eventually, it takes 4 years to write the opera. Several things are happening. It's a Norse mythology. Nobody is passionately in love. Nobody commits suicide over love. Nobody murders anybody over love. It's just a very Germanic plot. There's a great baritone aria in it, the only baritone aria that Puccini actually ever really wrote until he was almost, I think it was about in 1918. So, it takes a long time to do this. They're running out of money, and the board is getting quite upset with Puccini over this. At the same time, Puccini has started to live openly with a woman by the name of Elvira Gemignani. They don't really care that they're not married. What's really important, though, is Elvira is already married. She has a son by the name of Antonio, and they're living together openly, and they're running out of money. Ricordi says we have to stay by him no matter what. Edgar is finished, it's presented, and it's an abysmal failure. Plot and the music don't match. There's all sorts of problems. It is, however, what's referred to as un succès d'estime, a reputational success. The music is wonderful. It just doesn't fit the story. It's like 2 different things going on at the same time. So Ricordi realizes it's his fault. He says openly, one day at a party, I will let you choose anything you want for your next opera. And Puccini instantly says, I want to do an opera based on the novel Manon Lescaut. And Ricordi says, Jules Massenet just wrote that 5 years ago. It's a big hit even here in Italy. And there are 2 other operas based on her. Don't you want to do something else? And he says, oh no. She had more than one lover. She deserves more than one opera. And on top of that, I'm going to write the libretto myself, so, quote, no fool of a librettist can ruin it for me. The negotiations go on, and Ricordi allows him to write the opera Manon Lescaut on the condition he gets to choose the librettist. So he says, we're going to get Ruggero Leoncavallo. He just wrote I Pagliacci. It was a big hit. He did the libretto. He'll be the librettist for you. And they start to work together. 6 months later, Leoncavallo storms out of the house and is not going to work with him again. Ricordi says, all right, here's another librettist, work with him, and one lasts 4 months. He says, okay, there's a team of people we know. Why don't you work with them? 6 months, gone. Finally, he says, here's another pair, 2 guys by the name of Illica and Giacosa. And not only do they complete Manon Lescaut, they then write the next 3 or 4 operas with him. So it's a combination that works well. It is not without its fiery moments and long pauses where nobody's talking to one another. But Manon Lescaut opens, and it does fairly well. It's not a huge hit, but it does make lots of money. And Puccini does what many, still today, if you're an athlete or an artist and you suddenly come into a lot of money and you know it's going to be working, he buys a house for his mother. He buys land by a lake near Lucca called Torre del Lago, and he starts to build a house over there, and that's where he and Elvira and Antonio are going to live. So with Manon Lescaut, by the way, the funny part of Manon Lescaut, which actually does kind of tie in at the end, is that at the end of the opera, Manon Lescaut and De Grieux die of dehydration in the deserts outside of the city of New Orleans. So that does come back into it, but just remember that, American geography just did not mean anything to Italian composers. So at this point, Puccini's thinking, I'm going to write another opera. What can I write on? And he write as a plot. And he comes across a novel in his house, a French novel called Scenes from a Bohemian Life by Henri Murger. And it's really quite wonderful. It's so much about his own life, about what it was like as a student. And he says, this is great. I'm going to write an opera on this. And he asks Ricordi to get the rights. And Ricordi contacts Murger. And Murger says, yeah, well, that's really interesting, but Leoncavallo has the rights right now. And this starts the discussion as, did Puccini actually steal the show from Leoncavallo or not? Puccini, if you get to read a lot about him, just did not connect well with other human beings. And really, the fact that he probably did not remember for a minute that Cavallo had said, this is going to be my next opera, just is the real plausible story. But both of them are writing at the same time. He gives them both the rights. He doesn't care. One of them is going to work, maybe not. Throw enough stuff on a wall, we'll see what sticks. So they're both writing it. And Puccini's is finished first. And Bohème opens. Bohème comes on stage, it goes up. It's a total failure, an abysmal failure. One of the critics writes, La Bohème will leave no lasting mark on the lyric stage. The reason for it is something that we hope you'll recognize the difference tonight. The cast for an opera about young people was totally inappropriate. They were the old grand stars of the house, and they just could not carry off the youthfulness, the energy, the exuberance, and the passion of what it's like to be 18, 19 years old and desperately in love and poor and all of that. And tonight you'll see we have a very wonderful young cast, and I hope you'll understand the difference. Even if you've seen the Met broadcasts, you'll see the difference. Puccini goes to Ricordi and says, we're still ahead of Leoncavallo. And by the way, if you're ever anywhere and they're presenting Leoncavallo's Bohème, don't go. It's not worth it. There's one wonderful baritone aria because the Rodolfo's is the baritone, but it's really not worth the 3.5 hours you're going to spend there in the opera. So he says, let me recast it. Let me tour Italy. I'm going to get young singers and we'll present it and it will be a hit. And so Ricordi says, okay, but there's one condition. I get to pick the conductor. And he says, okay, who do you want? And he says, there's this wonderful young cellist at La Scala that I think would be a great conductor. And he says, a cellist? Really, a cellist as a conductor? And he said, absolutely, you're going to meet this guy, you're going to really get along. And a little argument back and forth in the letters as they get together, and Puccini gets to meet Arturo Toscanini, and the two of them hit it off, and they start this tour of Italy looking for young singers. Now, the music has been published, and the auditions are actually being sung with the music from the opera. And they're at one set of auditions, and this young tenor has just finished Che gelida manina, and he finishes, and he looks down, and right at the edge of the stage is Puccini staring up at him. And the young man just says, Maestro, is something wrong? And he said, who are you? Where do you come from? Who sent you here? And he said, Maestro, I don't understand. Who sent you here? Who sent you to us? Was it God? and I don't understand. And Toscanini in the hall says, so young man, your name again, it's Enrico Caruso? So that is how the three of them met and started an artistic friendship that lasts for years and years, even all the way up through after Girl of the Golden West. So that Bohème opens, and it's a hit. Very big success. And so Puccini is touring around, watching the productions as they're being developed. He's keeping control over certain things. As an example, at the end of Act 1, nowadays, you will often hear the tenor go for the high C. Right? It's not written in there. Puccini found out many years later that Caruso was singing a high C at that. And he sent him a scathing letter. Don't you dare sing that note there. I gave you a high C in the aria. It's not appropriate for you. Don't sing it. So we don't sing the high C. I don't want Puccini's ghost coming to come and get me on that. So he's in Paris, and while he's there, he sees a play called La Tosca. And it's written by Victorien Sardou, and it's a showcase for Sarah Bernhardt. And it's a marvelous play. It's a great play. And while he is in Paris, Puccini sends a letter to Ricordi saying, you must get me the rights for this. Well, the problem is Ricordi already had the rights, but he had given them to another composer. And realizing that if Puccini were really interested in it, he would write a better opera, has to do the old, here's a better opera for you, take it over here, slide it over to Puccini, and Puccini starts to work on Tosca. After a while, he too starts to have doubts. It's a 5-act French play, structured in a very French way, and to turn that into an Italian opera of 3 or 4 acts is really quite difficult. There's some brilliant stuff that he did to get that to work. But he's having problems, and Ricordi says, look, go back to Paris, talk to Sardou, see what the problem is. So he goes, and they're talking, and Puccini says, you know, it's a French play. I'm an Italian composer. And he says, it's not a French play. It's a Roman play. It takes place in Rome. Of course it needs an Italian composer. It needs Italian singing. There's no other way to do this as an opera. And at one point later in the conversation, he says, I'm not sure, Mr. Sardou, it's probably just a question of style. And the line they both record in their notes of it is that Sardou looks at me and he says, Monsieur Puccini, there is no such thing as style. There is only talent. Go write the opera. So he goes and he writes Tosca. Opening night of Tosca, an abysmal failure. One of the critics writes, nearly 3 hours of screaming. Another commentary is it's a tawdry melodrama not worthy of the stage. If you think about the plot of Tosca and the concept that there is a public official so venal that he abuses his power for his own personal gain, this really wasn't something the audiences, that was verismo, that was a little too real. They really weren't ready for that. It opened in January of 1900, and if you look at the number of performances between 1900 and 1950, and then 1950 to 2000, there are almost 20 times as many presentations in Europe. I think personally that World War II made it much more acceptable for the audience to understand political, abuse of political power. Tosca goes on. And he's in London, he's watching one of the productions, and he's there, and he goes to see a play by David Belasco. It's in English, set in Japan, called Madame Butterfly. Puccini speaks no English. He just watches the play and realizes that this is really incredible. He forces his way backstage. Belasco is there, and that night, gets from Belasco an agreement that he will write the opera. No negotiating, no anything. He leaves with the rights that night. Belasco later is asked about why he did that. And he said, well, you can't negotiate rights with an Italian who speaks no English. And on top of that, when he's got his arms wrapped around your neck and he's crying into your shoulder. So he writes Madame Butterfly. And he gets ready, Madame Butterfly is getting ready to open. It's out there, and it's, ready for it, an abysmal failure. Several reasons for that. What we now know as Act 1, the chorus scene at the wedding, was almost 3 times as long. There was lots of little bits for cousins and relatives. There's an uncle who gets drunk. Those lines still exist in the score, but it just was not what the audience cared about. It was in modern dress, which was a novelty at the time. What we now consider Act 2 and Act 3 was actually all run together. So you get to the end of what we think of Act 2. They're closing the shutters. They're waiting. You have the humming chorus. And now we take a break, but it didn't. It went straight into that orchestral section where you hear the ship crossing the ocean and then arriving in Mann and everybody coming up and all of that. And then we go straight into it. Well, that was way too long for it. You had a long first act, a long second act. This was not what the Italians wanted. And there was no aria for the tenor. Also, Madame Butterfly was Toscanini's mistress, and she was noticeably pregnant. At one point during the long second act, she stands too close to the edge of the stage, and a breeze comes up, because there's always a bit of wind that comes up from the pit, catches her kimono, it fluffs out, somebody in the hall yells, "Watch out, she's about to deliver!" Audience goes crazy. Later on, then, in what we now see as the start of the third act, there's beautiful music about the dawn. And there's even little bird whistles to show the birds are waking up. Well, by this point, the audience was ready for audience participation. And they started crowing like roosters, braying like donkeys, making barnyard animal sounds. The night was a total disaster. No intellectual property rights. Puccini gives Ricordi the money back and takes the score away so that it doesn't get presented and just die. He then works on it. He edits the first act down. He adds the tenor aria Addio Fiorito Asil, only in this second edition. He splits the second section, but even in the Ricordi version, you will see it is called Act 2, Scene 1, Act 2, Scene 2. He refuses to admit that he has to make a three-act opera. He works on it, it opens again, and it's now, the hit, the butterfly that we get to love and see all the time. By this point, Arturo Toscanini is the artistic director of the new Metropolitan Opera in New York City. And he convinces the board that as a developing organization, they must now commission a work, and it should be a work set in the United States. The fact that you would consider an American composer in English, this is just going to go by the wayside. So he convinces them that he's going to get Puccini to write an opera for the Met. Now, this is big. And so they get another David Belasco play called Girl of the Golden West, and he turns that into an opera. Enrico Caruso sings the lead, and it's a hit. The audience loves it. The critics, not so much. One of the critics writes, "It failed to capture some of the spirit of the American West." Now, I just want to go back to Manon Lescaut. Remember, they die in the deserts outside of New Orleans. The American West meant nothing to Puccini. Right? His next commission comes from a very unusual place. It comes from Vienna. And they want him to write an operetta called La Rondine, the Swallow. And so he accepts it. Now, at this point, Italy and Austria are in such tension that this is what's getting ready to build up to the Great War. And Toscanini and Ricordi say, "Don't take this commission. This is not right. You shouldn't be doing this." Well, Puccini doesn't really have a strong political core, doesn't really care much about politics, and he says, "But, I've never done an operetta. You'll never ask me to do an operetta. I get to write an operetta." He and Toscanini have an argument, and at one point in the discussion, Puccini says, let's face it, Italy could benefit from a little German-style organization. Toscanini gets up, walks out of the house, never going to speak to you again. He starts to write the operetta. He realizes he can't write an operetta. The dialogue makes no sense to him, how you go from one to the other. So he starts to slowly turn it into an opera. They're not so happy, but it's Puccini. And he's writing, and it takes the usual couple of years to get it done. And we get to Christmas. And Puccini's assistant comes into the office and says, "It's getting close to Christmas. Here's last year's Christmas list. What do you want to do?" And he says, "Whatever I did last year, just the same things. Just send the same things to everybody." And off he goes. A couple of days later, Puccini calls his assistant and he says, "Let me see that list." And he's going through it, and there it says, Arturo Toscanini, panettone. Now, panettone is like the Italian version of fruitcake, except you can actually eat it. So he sends off a telegram to Toscanini. It says, "Panettone, sent in error." Hours later, the note comes back from Toscanini, "Panettone, eaten by mistake." By the time La Rondine opens, he has turned it into an opera. He has none of the usual people looking at it, editing it for him. The war is on. He can't have it. They won't do it in Vienna. It gets done in neutral Monaco. And the Italians never forgive him for doing this La Rondine. It's almost never done in Italy, even to this day. There are some wonderful moments of it. It just is, he really needed Toscanini and Ricordi to be looking at him and saying, this one doesn't work, this is great. But there are some wonderful, wonderful pieces in it. And if you analyze it, it really is the sequel to La Bohème. So that's why, in fact, there's even a line in the fourth act where Rodolfo says to Mimi, back to its nest returns the swallow. And I think that that's the setup for making the next piece. As almost an apology to the Italian people, within 1 year, Puccini writes 3 one-act operas. They are the most incredible pieces, I think, that he writes. Like a novelist who is forced to write a short story, you compress everything into a brief amount of time. He writes Suor Angelica, which is, in my mind, the saddest opera, the most tragic opera ever written. It is just amazing. We've done it. Its theme is basically that the Virgin Mary has closer contact with God and Jesus than the Pope. And he was so nervous about that he wrote the opera, and one of his 6 sisters, what a surprise, is a nun, and he goes to her convent and plays the opera for the nuns. And at the end of it, he finishes, and he turns around to find out what they think, and they're all crying and sobbing, and they say, oh, go and write it, go and do it, go and do it. So, Suor Angelica. Il Tabaro, the cloak. One of the darkest, most somber investigations of human jealousy. It's just an incredible, powerful opera with a great, great dramatic aria for the bass baritone. And then Puccini puts into it his only true comedy, Gianni Schicchi, which just makes you wonder why, or wish that he had done more comedies. It is absolutely hysterical. It is often done even on its own these days. Puccini insisted, each one of them runs about an hour. Puccini insisted, you do one, you do the other 2. You can't, you do them all or you don't do them. And the Italian audiences weren't fond of 3 hours of music. Bohème, for example, full Bohème is 2 hours and 10 minutes of music. Most Verdi operas, 2 hours of music. This is what they aimed for. He eventually conceded to the crowd that, okay, you can do 2 of them. You don't have to do all 3. And nowadays, many people do one of the Puccinis and they pair it up with another piece. I often find it very interesting when they choose I Pagliacci, because the 2 of them so does not like one another that to put those 2 of them together is kind of an interesting pairing. He starts to write his last opera, and it's based on a Chinese tale called Turandot, Princess Turandot. And so he writes all the singing and the piano line all the way to the end, and then he goes to the front and he starts to orchestrate it with little notes down here. Okay, all right, I've done that here, so this over here needs to be reflective of that. If you listen to a Puccini opera, he really only writes half an opera, and you hear all the music from the first half and the second half again. So he's making all these notes about that. And as he gets to the great moment in it where the slave girl Liu commits suicide, he's very, very sick. He's coughing blood. It's a terrible problem. He's having problems breathing. Doctor says you have throat cancer. The place to go is Brussels. They're doing this experimental surgeries, and they have great success. You need to go. He was terminal. In those days, however, the doctors never told anybody. Antonio, his son, was told that even the surgery was not going to succeed, but they never bothered to tell anybody. The surgery was radioactive needles piercing the tumor. The tumor did shrink in size. However, the operation caused internal bleeding, and he bled to death, and he died the next day on November 29th, 1924, just short of his 66th birthday. Considering he wrote only 12 operas, it is amazing that if you ask people to name an opera, or name 3 operas, or any 2 composers, that one of his operas and his name will come up. And when you consider that nobody knows the first 2 operas, and that the 3 of those on top of that are then one-act operas, it's a phenomenal influence of the great operas that he wrote. There are two musical moments in the opera that I want to point out to you, that you listen when you come. In the first act, the tenor takes the hand of Mimi, and it's cold, and he sings the marvelous aria we all know, Che gelida manina. But it starts in the most disarming way. It's all on one note. Che gelida manina. It starts really, really slow, very unnoteworthy in any way, and then slowly but surely builds into this phenomenal aria. And it was quite a risk to do it that way, but Puccini thought that was great. The other one is in the fourth act. Mimi is dying. She's going to die in a chaise over there. And everybody, all the roommates are there. They all go one at a time. They all leave, and they're left alone. And she sings this piece called Sono andate. They all left. And if you listen to the music, it slowly, as every line, it goes down one note. It just descends and descends and descends, almost the full octave. She sings, it goes up, comes down a bit, and then she says the word love, and her voice leaps a whole octave. And it should now give you shivers when you get to that moment. It's an absolute incredible moment. I want to thank you all very much for being here, for coming to Opera Talk. We're going to open the hall in time, probably in about 20 minutes or so you can come back into your regular seats, as it were. But we need to do some tech work. We have to balance the lights and check everything. So thank you all very, very much for coming. I look forward to seeing you at 6 o'clock. Thank you. Thank you.